As much as it pains me to say, we are now heading into the F1 summer break, but that's not going to stop us from talking about what we saw this weekend at the Hungarian Grand Prix. What's going on, guys? Welcome back. The F1 season is now technically over halfway done, but we are heading into the summer break following the conclusion of the 2025 Hungarian Grand Prix. It was one of the races of all time. The Hungarian Grand Prix has really truly cemented itself as one of the true strategy races on the calendar, because there was a lot of instances today where you were really watching a lot of varied strategies kind of come out to play. You had multiple teams and drivers doing two stops. You had a couple doing one stops. You had some pitting early. You had some waiting and pitting late. And obviously, it came out differently for each and every one of them. It's going to get interesting to say the least. It really is just growing to be one of those races that I think really delivers on, through your eyes than it does on paper. So regardless, we're here to talk about what we saw in our quick hits. We're going to go over our weekend winners and losers for the Hungarian Grand Prix, and then we'll wrap things up by taking a look at our predictions that we made before the weekend began. Without further ado, and without any more incoherent ramblings from me, let's go ahead and jump on into this thing with our weekend quick hits. Let's start at the front and talk about McLaren. We'll say that Lando Norris wins the Hungarian Grand Prix for, I believe it was McLaren's 200th win in Formula One, so congratulations to them. Must be pretty good pickings for a race to win your 200th Grand Prix as an organization and as a race team going into the summer break. Get a lot of time to celebrate with everyone back at the factory. Probably honestly try and set something up for some of the legacy members of the organization as well. So congratulations to McLaren on that. 200 race wins is certainly nothing to, just nothing to laugh at. I mean, that's 200 Grand Prix, wins. And so, I mean, when you have an organization as old as McLaren that has had a lot of success and they sort of fell into a bit of a lull, it is one of those things where you definitely need to take a moment and acknowledge the fact that they've been on a really, really, really good run of form over the last, the beginning of 2025 and the way they finished 2024. And so to get their 200th in this race is very exciting. Lando Norris delivering that to them, although it was really touch and go because Oscar Piastri was also charging forward trying to take that honor for himself. We ended up seeing a bit of a strategy call race between the two sides of the McLaren garage, as obviously Oscar Piastri was in front of Lando most of the majority of the time, but at the same time it was in fact Lando who, probably thanks to a pretty bad start to the race, ultimately ended up getting on the better strategy to have track position and was able to hold off Oscar Piastri on much fresher tires down the last 10 to 15 laps. And it was a pretty exciting finish, but ultimately track position wins out, as it so often does, and Lando Norris takes the win. We had Oscar Piastri finishing just behind him in P2 for another 1-2 for McLaren in 2025. Shocker, I know, let me tell you. And then obviously George Russell rounding out the podium, as someone obviously has to, and takes home another podium for himself and Mercedes, who had a bit of a bounce back weekend from a tougher weekend in Spa last time out. So it was a good, exciting race. Obviously, it did not start there. Charles Leclerc started the race on pole position, which just goes to show that exciting qualifyings really do make a lot of Grand Prix weekends. We obviously saw Charles do very well over the first half to 2/3 of this race before ultimately, I don't know what Ferrari did. We obviously heard a lot of radio messages from Charles, obviously voicing his displeasure at some of the things that Ferrari did over the course of this race. Obviously, some strategy calls and some decisions were made, and I think Charles was a bit let's just call it aggrieved by these decisions. And ultimately, while we did see Charles, lead into turn one and actually pull a bit of a gap to, Oscar, whether or not that was really Oscar's choosing more so than not, but we saw a Ferrari that looked pretty quick in clear air, and obviously Charles must have been feeling pretty good, but by the time his final pit stop came in, his pace fell like I don't even know. He went from being on pace with the McLarens to being multiple seconds a lap slower than George Russell in the Mercedes. Obviously, he ultimately ended up with a penalty for erratic driving when George finally caught up to him to take his third place away. And you could tell that Charles was just not having a very good finish to this race after what probably could have been at absolute minimum been at least a P2 probably, or at absolute minimum on the podium. So my only assumption to make is that Ferrari adjusted some aero spec, probably presumably front wing, in one of the pit stops, and it just absolutely, Charles just fell out of the groove with the car and ultimately finished a dozen or so seconds behind George Russell in this race. A bit of a tough one for Charles Leclerc in this one, but ultimately it is to the benefit of George Russell, who gets on the podium once again. But it is those sort of battles that you see that really do make things a little bit exciting. When you know that it's going to be a 1-2 for McLaren, that instance with George and Charles is kind of all you really have to look forward to, besides the McLarens potentially fighting it out. But ultimately, it was a Lando win, an Oscar P2, and George Russell P3. It was honestly pretty good. We got to talk about the Aston Martin rocket ships that were this weekend. From the jump of the weekend, they were absolutely rapid from the go. All the way back in FP1, they came out of the weekend firing on all cylinders and ultimately came home with a pretty solid result. Fernando Alonso running his own race, as he always seems to do in these teams, causing honestly a little bit of chaos up and down the front end of the grid because he just refused to pit. He was one of the people who went really long in his first stint and caused a little bit of chaos for the front runners around him as he just silently went about his way, ultimately coming home, I believe it was in P5. And so a very good result for Aston Martin, who looked absolutely dreadful around Spa. And so it was a good result for Aston Martin to get there up in the top 5. And we were a brief, Oscar Piastri lockup away from a Fernando Alonso podium in 2025. So it was very close, and it was a very good weekend for Aston Martin. You want to talk about a good weekend though? Let's talk about Gabriel Bortoleto, who once again put in an absolute banger of a weekend and really seems to be holding and coming into his own here in Formula One. Out-qualifies Nico Hülkenberg, makes it into Q3, qualifies P6, I believe it was, or 7, one of those, but ultimately ends up coming home to finish the race in P6. Absolutely fantastic as we now look at a Sauber as potentially, at least this weekend, faster than a Red Bull. No, not even a Red Bull. Faster than the Red Bull, as Bortoleto came home to finish P6 with Max Verstappen down in P9, I think it was, or P8. Either way, it was behind a Sauber, and I think we have to stop complaining about the Sauber quite as much as we used to, because that, midfield pack, and potentially all the way down to even like the Alpine, but even Pierre can put in a fantastic result every once in a while. Those cars are all extremely close together, and Bortoleto absolutely killing it, taking a lot of positive momentum going into the summer break. Have to commend the young man. I mean, I don't know if anyone should be too surprised. I think we all kind of wrote him off a little bit, just the fact that he was going to be driving a Sauber, but at the same time, he has been on fire, and we have to mention that. I sort of touched on it a little bit as well, but Red Bull really struggling this weekend, kind of the counterpoint to the Bortoleto and the Aston Martin points. But man, Max Verstappen looked on the back foot, kind of it's exactly the opposite of the Aston Martins, where he and Yuki really were struggling basically from the jump this weekend. Ultimately, Yuki Tsunoda knocked out in Q1 in qualifying. Max ends up making it into Q3, but just and barely puts together a decent enough lap, finishes down the order there in Q3, and ultimately barely, honestly, luckily avoids not finishing outside the points with his incident and run-in with Lewis during the race. Ultimately, the stewards deciding that there was nothing there after the race ended. Their investigation concluded with they actually didn't touch. And so no penalty for Max, but he ends up coming home P9 and was very close from finishing outside the points. Yuki Tsunoda, also a really tough day for him as he continues to struggle in the Red Bull. And man, Red Bull, I'm sure, is one of the teams that was begging for the summer break to get here so they could take 5, take a bit of a step back, and try to evaluate where they're at, because man, oh man, did they really struggle this weekend. Kind of elsewhere around the grid, there was a lot of teams that really were kind of nowhere. Alpine obviously struggled a little bit. Haas definitely didn't seem to have any pace. The Williams had moments, but at the same time really came out nowhere. Alex Albon really struggling in qualifying, with Carlos Sainz having issues going through the field. himself, and so it was just kind of a long day for a lot of the rest of the grid. Hungary is definitely one of those tracks where you'll end up being lapped once or potentially twice depending on the car, and it could just turn into a long 70 laps running there towards the back. We saw a little bit of action and on-track passing going on, but at the same time, it's hard to get too excited when you're running down the order. Oliver Behrman actually, unfortunately, ended up having to retire from the race. I didn't see exactly why it was. I remember seeing a radio message talking about how he had rear end damage, and ultimately I think they might have just made a business decision with him to kind of pull the car in, try and save what components they could, and ultimately he ended up being the lone retirement from this race. But at the same time, the rest of the grid, not really a whole lot to say. All right, let's move on and quickly go over our weekend winners and losers. This was actually an interesting one where you could kind of make a case for a lot of people. I ended up going with my decisions. You'll let me know down in the comment section below, I'm sure, if you disagree or hopefully if you agree with my decisions. But let's kick this off with our weekend winner. And this weekend, I'm going with Gabriel Bortoleto. I mean, the rookie has been killing it. He had a fantastic qualifying, followed up by a fantastic race. He ended up making pretty decisive moves in the beginning and was able to hold his own, honestly hold his own, down the stretch of this race. Ended up bagging himself quite a lot of points for him and his Sauber team as they are charging up the order of the constructors standings, as they have put in some absolutely great results in the first half of the 2025 season. So Gabriel was fantastic. I'm excited to see what he can do in the second half of the season. And yeah, honestly, I don't even really know what more there really is to say. I did briefly debate on going with Aston Martin or Fernando Alonso, who really had a good weekend. I kind of touched on it, but I'm a sucker for a good rookie story. And ultimately, I think Gabriel Bortoleto wins out. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comment section below who you would give your weekend winner to. For weekend loser, you could honestly go a lot of different directions. I think Red Bull was a good shout. I think Max Verstappen individually was probably a good shout. You had Lewis Hamilton having his probably worst Hungarian Grand Prix we've seen of his career. We've seen, I don't even know, there was Oliver Behrman, who had a pretty decent run and had a chance at points, ultimately DNFing from this one due to mechanical retirement. But I'm going to go with Charles Leclerc this weekend. Obviously, the Ferrari was pretty quick from the jump. Obviously, from the beginning of the weekend, I think we saw that there was a little bit of pace in that red car. And obviously, Charles taking pole position away from the two McLarens, he really struggled on their final laps, was a huge boon to him, as well as leading into turn one. And then for about at least half the race, we saw a Ferrari under Charles Leclerc that had the pace, at least of the McLarens, and was able to hold a healthy gap. They were able to respond to the strategy calls necessary to keep him in the lead. But there was a point somewhere along the way where Ferrari made a decision where they went from challenging McLaren for a win to being at least 1 second a lap slower than George Russell in the Mercedes, ultimately falling outside the podium altogether. And when you put in a lap like that in qualifying and have that good of pace at the beginning part of the Grand Prix itself, to all of a sudden getting yourself a penalty for erratic driving and finishing off the podium, that's extremely tough. Just looking at the grand scheme of things, I think the one team and driver who's probably going to be kicking themselves the most is Charles Leclerc. So for that reason, I'm going with Charles for my weekend loser. All right, let's get on to it. Our predictions, results from the Grand Prix weekend. We'll start with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went with Kimi Antonelli, who had been struggling mightily since his podium in Canada, finishing outside the points and really struggling with some confidence potentially with that Mercedes car underneath him. Ultimately, he came home to finish in the points once again here in Hungary. It might have been only in P10, but at the same time, it must feel good for the young man to kind of get back up into the top 10. Maybe not necessarily feeling too great, but I think at least a little bit of momentum to carry forward going into the summer break. So, in the points, that's a point for me. 1 for 1 to start the day. As we move on to my pick for biggest disappointment, I went with Liam Lawson, one of the RB drivers who had been kind of the exact opposite, had a bit of a good run of form lately, but it had been a minute since we've seen a true stinker. We've seen Isaac Hadjar have a lot of issues on particular weekends, and I think we might run into an opportunity to see a bit of a flip for the RB team, with Lawson potentially taking a step back and Hadjar maybe getting a little bit of confidence back. Ultimately, it was not to be, as Lawson finished, I believe, P8 this weekend. So ultimately, no point for me there. So it is what it is. As we move on now to my qualifying top 3, I had a Max Verstappen P3, a Lando Norris P2, and an Oscar Piastri pole position. Charles Leclerc came in and said, absolutely not, will not be having any of that confidence or points scoring, predicting both McLarens to be 1-2 on the front row. Charles Leclerc ultimately, like I mentioned, take pole position. We had Oscar Piastri P2 and Lando Norris P3. So all in all, that is a single point in total with a half point for both McLaren drivers as they finished in different positions than I predicted them. So it was touch and go there for a minute. Probably should have been closer to what I said. Obviously, Max Verstappen being the big outlier there, but ultimately I'm happy to take away a single point, better than anything less than that. As we move on now to my pick for the race podium, I had an Oscar Piastri win, a Lando Norris P2, and I wish I could take credit for a George Russell P3, but no, I picked Lewis Hamilton going into the Hungarian Grand Prix. Felt like a pretty safe bet, but ultimately was not to be, as I don't know if he could be having a worse time in the Ferrari car right now, and so ultimately no for me on that one. Another instance of both McLarens being in there, but in the wrong positions. Obviously, Lando won, Oscar coming in second, and George Russell on the podium. So another point for me there. So we're slowly but surely adding them up. As we move on to my one crazy prediction, and this one finally comes in. I believe it's the first time this prediction has ever come in. My one crazy prediction was that we'll have 7 different constructors finish in the top 10. It just feels like one of those years where the parity in the midfield is the craziest it's ever been. And I think we're in for an exciting race from top to bottom. And ding, 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 I believe we had exactly 7 constructors in the top 10. First time I've seen that in a very long time, and the first time I predicted this and for it to come true. So we'll take that point all the way to the bank. As we now move on, I scored 4 points on the weekend, not too shabby. Been on a very consistent run of scoring decent points. As we take a look now at our predictions standings, and if my math is correct, but guys, that only leaves one question remaining. What is next in Formula One? And the answer is realistically not a lot. We're going into a multi-week break. The summer break is officially here. I know we just had like a 3-week break just a couple of weekends ago, but we're back at it once again. So nothing really to look forward to. We'll have our mid-season review video going live here in, I don't know, a week or two. Probably targeting, the midpoint of the summer break. We'll take a look at everything we've seen so far here in 2025. We'll review my season predictions to see how they're stacking up. I don't think they're going to go very well. And then we'll take a look forward at the rest of the 2025 season. So hope you enjoy the break. I'm sure we all could use a little bit of a reprieve from F1, distance makes the heart grow fonder, something like that. And so guys, I hope you enjoyed the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend. I hope you get some nice time away. Enjoy some other motorsports series that are still ongoing. I'm sure they would love to have you take a peek in. And as always, we will be back to talk about all things Formula One as we get closer to the return post-summer break. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for me here in this one, and I'll see you guys in the next one.